Getting everybody here. It's almost winter, you guys. I guess that's good. Here pretty soon it'll be like a year since we started doing this COVID stuff. And look at you guys doing something productive in the meantime. So smart.
I'm staring off into space and we'll breathe on this phone.
Do what?
As I'm staring off into space and he's on his phone.
Yeah, but you're here, you're ready, you're trying, we're all trying, right? I was thinking about it, this is the time of the semester where a lot of the teachers just sort of stop giving you assignments and things. You guys will mention. People will say in passing, this one teacher hasn't updated Canvas for, like 3 weeks. I feel that way. So we'll keep forging ahead though. Keep trying and keep trying. So we all will get behind on things. I've had to spend a lot of time with the REPL stuff. So that's pulled away from the time I need for grading and things like that. But unexpected things happen. We were working on our little database for chapter 21 for our system. So let's see where we were. I know you guys have been, most of you have been working on databases those days. So let's review where we are in this class. We created our inventory table. So if you get into SQL Server Management Studio, Jackie, turn up your heat. I bought one of those fancy, like a thermostats that I can communicate with my phone. And so I set all the settings, you know, to make it not run so much during the day while I'm at school and things like that. And it keeps arguing with me, and it keeps turning the heat down even lower. So my husband keeps laughing at me that my fancy thermostat has gone into dad mode and keeps knocking the heat back down, and it's freezing. So I think I finally got a handle on it, convinced it to let me be the boss, get the house warmed up. So if you get onto SQL Server Management Studio and you make sure to use your CIS151 server, not your CIS250 server, and then you expand your database, when you expand your tables, you should see your inventory table. When we're working with SQL Server Management Studio, there's a couple of ways we can kind of see what we have on our table, like column-wise, design-wise. We can keep expanding, and as we look at our different categories, we'll see a category for columns. So we can just expand that, and that'll show us all of the different columns that we have on that table. And for right now, that's the best way for us to make sure we have this thing configured properly. So we saw for our inventory table, we had a car ID, and it's our primary key, and we set it up as an integer, and we made it to be one of the identity columns so that it's an auto number column. The database management system will automatically fill that in for us. Then we had our make, our color, and our pet name, and we set all those to be variable length character data. I sort of didn't take attendance because it'll drive me crazy. So let me get that going here on the side. We're looking at our book. They'd like us to create some other tables. We put some data in that table. We could open a new query window and type select star from inventory and run that query to see what all data elements we had entered into our table. Now we have a couple of people that didn't get that table created. So to create a new table, remember here on your tables category in Management Studio, you can just right click and say new table. So those people that didn't get that inventory table created, let's try to do that real quick. You might need some updates and we can help you with it, but let me get attendance while you're doing that. I think we have most everybody. Wait, Mary's here. I said she was not here. You guys are all here. Richard's here. Okay. We've got everybody in one place or another. Okay, so we had created our inventory. Let's create another table. The next table that they want us to create is going to be an associative table. Oops, wait. One more thing for our inventory table. I was going to skip it. We want to create a stored procedure on our inventory table. And a stored procedure is just a saved little chunk of code that does something when somebody calls it. So it's just a little function that we can create in our database. And for this one, we're going to create this stored procedure, and we'll use it later on. So this is something that we'll be learning more about as the semester goes on, but we're just going to go ahead and create one. So let's see. We want to expand under our database programmability. And under that section, you should see stored procedures. And if we expand that, we'll see that we have system ones, but we don't really have any. So it's kind of like our table. We don't have any to start with. So again, I'm going to right click and click stored procedure. And it's going to give me this awful template that's got all these sort of things in it and stuff. Yeah, I don't think I like any of that. So let's just create a new query instead. We'll do it ourselves. So we are going to use create syntax. And we use the keyword create when we want to create something new in our database. When we created our inventory table, we used the GUI, the graphical user interface, to create it. But we could have said create table inventory and use this create syntax also. And we'll be looking at this in the 250 class in the next couple of weeks. So it's stuff that's coming. But we want to create this stored procedure. So the keyword is procedure for us. And we're going to name this thing get pet name. So a lot like any code that we would do in any other language. In SQL Server, variables have an @ sign at the beginning of their name because they're kind of special. They just exist for within the stored procedure. So we're going to create a variable named car ID, and it's going to be an integer. We already said our car ID is an integer, so that makes sense. We're going to have another variable to hold our car's pet name, and they're making it character 10 and output. Those are the only variables we need. So after our variable declaration, we can have our code. Our code has to be preceded by the as keyword. So we're saying create this procedure that's going to use these two variables or even two parameters if we want to send them to it. And then the code is going to be after the as keyword. So our code is going to say select our pet name variable by setting it equal to the pet name column from our inventory table. Where our car ID equals the variable car ID. So when someone calls this stored procedure, they're going to pass us a car ID. We're just going to use that in the where clause to get that one particular car row back from our database. So our select statement will run, and it will load the pet name variable with the pet name value from our table that matches our car ID, and then it will output that. So our program that calls the storage procedure is going to pass in a car ID and get back the pet name of that car from the stored procedure. So let's save this thing, execute. And now again, if we come over on the left and refresh our stored procedure list, we should see that we have our get pet name method. Notice that our get pet name is almost like a getter, right? So this is going to tie into our C# code. So if we had a getter that was going to return the value of a pet name of a certain car, that getter code could call the stored procedure, right, to get that out of the database. So we can have those multiple layers. So the getters that we've been creating, that we've just been using like random data from our class, well, in reality, they're probably going to run something like this to go get data from the database. That's going to be important information for us to get. Okay, so we'll be using that later. Now let's create our other tables. I'm going to go back to my tables category. And if I want to roll all this other stuff up, I can. And in my tables, I'm going to create another new one. And the first one is going to be our customers table. And it's going to have a cust ID. Now our customer ID is going to be just like our car ID. So it's going to be an integer. We're not going to allow nulls because it's going to be our primary key. And we want this to be an identity column. So we're going to come down to our column properties, find that setting identity, change is identity from no to yes. This is also going to be our primary key. So I think we can just click on this little key up here since we're on that column, and that will set the primary key to. Last time I think we right-clicked on the column. So we have lots of different ways of accomplishing those tasks. Now next, our first name. And they want this to be N varchar for 50. Let me find it. I won't have to type it. And nulls are okay. Our last name, same thing. Allow nulls. And they wanted us to create it using the syntax, but we've used the GUI instead. So let's save it, right click on it, and save table, and name it customers. And this is a really big deal in database design. Notice that they named our cars table inventory. They're going to name our customers table with an S as a plural. That's a really big debate in the field of database design. Some people like tables to be named plural like that. Other people are really against it. So it's a really fun debate. If you want to get out there, you know, get on some of the forums, express your opinion. Should it be plural? Should it not be plural? I think that it should be singular, because anytime we go after a customer, we're looking for a specific customer. And the fact that our table contains all of them is a given, right? Okay, let's refresh. That's just opinions. So now I have my customers table and my inventory table. And again, we named ours all in uppercase since that's what our CIS250 book is kind of recommending. It's a little bit different than our CIS151 textbook. You can see that there's definitely some differences of opinion. That's always fun. Let's create this next table using code instead of using the GUI. So I'm going to click New Query, and I'm going to make sure that I'm using my database. Then create table orders. Oh, got a bunch of messages. Sorry, guys. Guys, don't harass me about getting stuff on the YouTube channel, okay? I am working my hardest, and I will say something like I'm just not going to record them anymore if you keep harassing me about it. Do you understand? Just so that You know I'm doing the best that I can, just like you are. So you get with your group if you're having trouble with stuff and the video's not available on YouTube yet. Remember, those videos are only for your convenience. They are not guaranteed. Sometimes I run into technical difficulties. Sometimes they're very long and they're very hard to work with. I actually have students that only come to class on days where they have other classes where the teachers don't do Zoom videos. So how's that make a teacher feel, huh? Like you only come here because your other teacher doesn't do Zoom on these days, but you don't come on the days that you have my class because I try to make it convenient for you. So remember, those conveniences are not guarantees. All righty. You guys might have to do a bit report on me and say, she's a little pissed. Somebody harassed her about videos when she was trying to do a lesson, and she just went right off the deep end. So let's create our orders table. We're going to have an order ID. It's going to be an integer, and we're not going to allow nulls. We are going to have this be our primary key, and it's going to be an identity column. So all those same things that we could specify in the GUI, we can specify through our code. Next, we're going to have a customer ID. It's an integer, and it's not null. And then car ID. Again, an integer and not null. All right, so we should be able to run that and create our orders table. That'll look right. We wanted all of those good things. That looks good. So now we should be able to refresh our tables. And have all of our stuff. Let's add some data to those. We want to add some data to our customers table first. So I'm going to right click on that customers table and say edit top 200 rows. And for our customers then, we only have to enter their names, right? Because our identity column is an auto column. And you guys need to remember that when you're doing your insert and update code for the database. When you insert new rows, you will not supply a value for an identity column because the database will take care of that itself. So oftentimes students will try to supply a value for an identity column and they'll get errors. It'll cause a lot of confusion, but the database is going to take care of that. Okay, we have Dave Brenner, Matt Walton, and you might be able to add, want to add some additional test data. Up to you. We want to get a good amount. In our examples here, you'll see that we have some duplicates. We always want to do things like that. We have 2 Waltons here, so that if we do a select by last name, we can make sure that we are accounting for both of those, that we get a collection back from that select statement instead of just one individual row. So that should be some good test data for us for our customers. And then we want to go ahead and add in some orders now that our customers have numbers. Now at this point, is we add in our test data, none of the table relationships exist. So we could add in orders that don't have valid customers. We could violate all of those rules of referential integrity because we don't have any of those relationships created yet. So we're going to be careful and make sure that when we put in our orders, we're only using information for customers that actually exist. So let's go ahead and do that, edit our top 200 rows. And we're just going to create this kind of link table that's going to say customer ID 1 bought car ID 5 or is interested in car ID 5. Not exactly sure how our database is keeping that relationship. If it's something that shows a purchase or just an interest. Next, customer ID 2 is associated with car ID 1. And I'm making sure here that we're getting the same order IDs as shows in our textbook, but it's no big deal because if we had to maybe delete one of these rows and recreate it, or we got something in here wrong, we would get some different order IDs. We cannot reset that identity column value back to 1 unless we were to drop and recreate the table. So don't worry about those identity columns getting off, because that's just something that happens as we use a table. They are unique values. Okay, we're going to have 3 and 4 for our next row, and finally 4 and 7. Now we do need to create the relationships so that the database understands that these tables are related to each other. It's not going to figure that out unless we tell it. So I'm going to close out of all these tabs, make sure all my data is saved. Down here to this next value, make sure I saved it. I'm not going to save this create syntax right now because we can come back and get that for us later. Now we could run a select statement from each of our tables here and make sure we got all of our data loaded properly. And SQL Server is complaining at me because the IntelliSense editor is not really like super dynamic. So since these tables have been created, since it has investigated what's out there, it's saying they don't exist. But if we run our query, it should be able to find them and resolve that just fine. And we can see our output from all 3 of our select statements. Now, if we wanted to only run the first one and the third one, we could select them. Oops, can't do non-contiguous, I lied. But if I just want to run these 2, if I select them and click execute, only this query code that is selected will be executed. Alrighty, so we've got some data, we've got some tables. Let's create our relationships. They say the easiest way to create table relationships is by creating a database diagram. There's been some trouble with SQL Server Management Studio in the last couple of releases and database diagrams. You know, Microsoft doesn't like creating those kinds of drawings and stuff outside of its drawing tools, but we're going to see if it'll work. So right-click the database diagrams node and select new database diagram. Oh, let's go ahead and select install diagram support first. And then yes, we would like to create these objects. That's pretty quick. And then we should be able to create a new database diagram. Now, before we create the diagram, it's like, which tables do you want to include on your diagram? Well, I would like to include all of them. So I can just click on one and click add. And I could probably multi-select and click add. Either way, I'm going to add all 3 of the tables to our diagram and then close. Now, in order to add a relationship, I can use the diagram kind of in the way I would create an entity relationship diagram relationship by just drawing the relationship between the 2 tables. Now, I need to start kind of at my table that's going to be 1 if I'm looking at a one-to-many type relationship, because I want to have the table that is sort of the one that has the primary key, be that side of the relationship, if you know what I mean. So let's start with our customer. Our customer has orders. So I'm going to click on the customer ID on the customer here and drag that to our orders, maybe. Click the car ID column and drag it to the orders table. Oh, did you see I had to get over here beside the column in that area to actually drag it? So I'm going to drop this customer ID onto my orders table customer ID. Did you see it? Did it do it? Did it work for everybody? Kind of funky. Now, it's going to give us a relationship name, and that's fine. It says our primary key table is our customers table, which is correct. And our primary key is our customer ID. Our foreign key table is our orders table, and its foreign key is the customer ID. That's right. So I'm going to click OK. Now, there's more information on this screen about that relationship. It has ability for us to determine how much automatic checking of referential integrity and different things like that we want to occur. So some different options that we have. Do we want to make sure that when we insert or update table order entry, whoops, let me say that again. When we enter rows in our orders table, do we want to make sure that an associated customer exists? If a customer gets updated, do we want to update all of the associated orders? If a customer gets deleted, do we want to delete the associated orders? They say that we would like to cascade our updates and our deletes. So we should be able to click on this down arrow and choose cascade. So that means if I delete a customer, it's going to cascade and delete all of their associated orders. That should be all we need to change on that screen. So let's click OK. And then we want to do the same thing from our inventory side. So on my car ID, I want to drag it to my orders table to create that relationship between my inventory and my orders. So again, that relationship, the primary key table is our inventory table. The foreign key table is our orders table. We want to cascade, whoops, got to expand that area. We want to cascade those deletes and those updates. Yay. Now our database is done. Yay. So we have 3 tables and we have all of our relationships between them set up so that we can see what customers are making, like what orders. Now within our database diagram, we can save it. They call it auto lot diagram. So if you create a database, like you're employee database, you can create a diagram for it in the same kind of way. You would just pick those tables to add to your diagram when you were creating it. Okay, Aaron, did you find it? Everybody okay? Now, Aaron says he's getting an error message, and some of these things that we're doing, you know, if we follow along and we follow what the textbook says, it's all going to work. But it is really important to realize that that's because we are doing that. So if I look at my customers table and I look at the columns, and then I look at my orders table and I look at the columns, my customer ID has to be the exact same data type between those two tables for me to be able to create that relationship. They don't have to be named the same. I could be using any sort of integer field to create that relationship, but they do have to both be integers. So as soon as I start, you know, using different data types, or like up here in our customer, we used N varchar, you know, and we might have used a different varchar data type in a different area, that could potentially cause us trouble. That's why it's so important to do that database design so thoroughly, to make sure that we know what all of our different data elements are, because we end up having to go back and drop tables and recreate them to fix those kinds of things. So that's okay. It could just be a problem. All right. So beautiful. We should all have our tables all set. Anybody got any problems? Because we want to make sure we've got these all set, or our examples won't work properly, and then we'll be in trouble. So if anybody's got issues, let's get them fixed before we continue on.
It won't let me save the diagram because it's saying that I need to drop my inventory table.
Let's see what it's doing. I'm going to stop sharing so you can share. Show us what it's doing to you. Aaron, hang on and we'll take a look at yours. They don't have to have the same ID, but they have to have the same data type, like int. What's it mad at you about?
So when I try to save this, okay, it tells me that the changes aren't permitted.
Okay, so let's take a look at it. Click cancel, and can you click on that line that shows the relationship between the inventory and the orders? You should be able to double click on it to bring up that relationship window again. It's kind of hard to get right into that relationship though on that line. Properties might be enough. Let's look over there to the side and see if we can see everything. So we've got our insert and update. It tells us expand the table and column specifications category. So what do we have there? We have orders, car ID, and then I can't quite see good on the inventory. What's the field name?
Which one? This one?
Yeah, down below that.
It's the lowercase car ID from the inventory.
But it's still an integer, right?
It should be.
Let's check. Can you expand your tables? Yeah, anywhere you can go. Let's make sure.
It should be int
int. Rich is saying he had trouble yesterday and he had to close and reopen the tool management studio. It can be such a pain.
Well, I can try close and reopen it, and we can look at someone else.
Well, delete your inventory and at least save what you have. See if you can say yes. All right. So yeah, just cancel and delete it off the diagram. So you're not really deleting it, so it might be removed from diagram or something like that. Yeah.
And then I guess just hit no, or
Yeah, you'll probably have to say no.
okay. And then save this.
Is this what yours is doing too, Erin?
It just doesn't like my inventory table. Like,
It's really mad at you. Yeah, let's just close this thing and reopen it.
I'll stop sharing. See if closing, reopening it. This is it.
We want to see what it does. So share again so we can see, because that evil thing shouldn't make you do that. Is it being nicer?
I'm opening it back up. Hopefully it mostly saved.
It won't let you create your relationships. Go ahead and share with us, Erin, and let's see what it's doing. Well, I was fixing hers up. We'll get all these problems resolved with this silly tool. So you try to create them, and what does it do to you?
Okay, so let me drag this over. Cust ID, come on, cust ID.
I'm muted, hang on.
So I set it so that I'm selecting the correct one. When I click OK, it says they do not match. However, when we go to my designer, so these are all ints. My car ID is an int, and my cust ID is an int.
Where's your primary key on that one?
What was that?
Your primary key on your customer?
Just a second.
It looks like it didn't get it.
I'm not exactly sure what you guys are talking about. I think my internet cut out when you were talking about that.
On your customer?
Yes.
We need to have a primary key. So right where you are, if you just go up into the toolbar and click that little key icon, it'll make that column the primary key. Do you see up in your toolbar?
Just a second. The Zoom thing's covering half my toolbar.
We can see it.
I can't see it. Okay, let's rescan my.
And Rich is saying you can create it from your diagram too.
Okay. Closing and opening it.
Okay, so if I can do it from a
It fixed it?
diagram.
Okay, Ivy's is working from opening and closing, so good news yet bad news. Set primary key.
Just a second. Here it is.
Yay. Okay, now your inventory is going to be that same way that we don't have a primary key. Beautiful.
Voila.
Now
And then
either
do with
insert and update specs. Make those both cascade.
Is that it?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Nice. How's everybody else doing? Everybody else getting it okay? Again, we want these ones to be created and working. So let us help if there's trouble.
Yeah, let's see if it saves.
Yeah. Auto lot. Yep.
Okay.
Beautiful. Okay. So we're starting to see how it can look like everything's fine in your database, and then it can kind of reach up and bite you later when something doesn't quite match up with the way it wants it to be. So that's why I keep saying, let's make sure everybody's is working. So if you're having any sort of trouble, let us know. So
Before we continue, that first stored procedure, I wasn't able to get all that. So if you could pull that up real quick, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Let's find it. I'm going to share mine.
All right, let me stop sharing.
Okay, so in our stored procedure, it's kind of weird, but once we've created it, we can't really go back and see the exact thing that we entered, but we can see what the stored procedure is. So let's see if I can go into modify and get an idea of what that stored procedure is. So here it is. So if you remember, we started kind of right here where we put that keyword create, and then we had procedure, and then our variable names and as. So that's the part we need, Aaron, is from there on. All of the stuff above that is just kind of like setting SQL Server defaults and things that the server does, generates that code for us automatically when we say, hey, generate some code for me. So we've created this procedure in the past with code. We want to see that old code. The server's like, okay, here it is, but I put all this extra stuff around it for you just for fun. You know, I stopped whenever we created that table and I said, oh, we need to create this stored procedure. And I made it sound like that stored procedure was dependent on that table. Well, it sort of is, because that's the table we use in the stored procedure, right? But it's not really related to it in the database. We could add any other sort of table access we wanted to or anything in this stored procedure. So don't get that thought in your head because of the way I said that it's dependent upon the table, because it's really not. It's just a piece of code that we have saved somewhere. Got it?
Working on it.
You're getting it. Okay, if we've got our stored procedure here that we can generate the code for, we can do that same thing with our tables. So if you right click on one of your tables, you can say script table as, So if I decide that I'm going to create this table in another server, I'm not using SQL Server, I have Oracle, and I need to copy this table over there, and my table has 57 columns, and I don't want to re-enter all of that, I can use this scripting ability, and I can say, generate create table syntax to a new query window or to a file. Well, let's do a new query editor window. It'll take it just a second while it's thinking about it. And what it's going to do then is generate the code for us to create our customers table. So you know how that last table we created, we did it by manually entering the code. We can save this create table syntax code off somewhere to a file. And then if we need to recreate this table, we can. So in the 250 class, you know, I've given you those scripts to create all of the tables that we need. This is what we're using. So we can save the code for all 3 of our tables if we want to. And that way then we can recreate them if something were to go wrong and we had some sort of problem. So I could save this. And I could put it wherever I want. I'll go to my CIS151 folder. And I could say, if I create a new folder, it's my auto lot. My external is being a little weird. Auto lot folder. And here is my create customer. And it's going to save it as a .sql type file. Then for my inventory, I can right click, say script table as create to a query editor window. Then I can save that. And of course I could have scripted it directly to this file. I don't need to go through this process of looking at it in the query editor window and then saving it. But I want you to be thinking about what we're saving here. I can create inventory. And then finally, I can do the same thing with my orders. Script table as create to new query editor and save it. And then we have all of our create table syntax saved. Normally, as a database administrator or a developer that needs to recreate these tables, we would copy all 3 of those into one table creation script that we could run. And then that way we could just save that script and use it wherever we needed to. And just like you've seen for our 250 class, we can also include our SQL syntax in there to insert rows into our table to make our test data and things like that. So we could set this one up kind of the same way it was for our other class and get everything all ready to go. And I really contemplated doing that for you guys, but then you wouldn't gain the experience of having created it yourself. So there's, you know, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It does take some time, but we can do that code really easily too. So our database should be all created. We should be able to connect to it. Let's see if we can. I'm going to open Visual Studio. And we know last time we were able to connect to an access database with our car inventory table. So now we're going to be trying to connect to our SQL Server database. And we have more tables in there. We just made it a little bit more full-fledged. Now this first project, I want to create a new project. And I ran into that thing you guys have mentioned several times over the semester or 2 about the .NET Core versus the .NET Framework. And we need to make sure that this console app that we're going to create is using a .NET framework. Because remember, we're using ADO, Active Data Objects, .NET. So if we don't have a project that uses the .NET framework, then we don't have access to those components that we want. So I could just click .NET framework over here because I've used it recently, or I can scroll through, because in mine it was quite a ways down, which caused me some consternation and much confusion this morning, making me angry because it wouldn't do what I needed it to. I know that never happens to you guys. I can't find it, so I'm going to be lazy and choose .NET Framework up here. And of course, you could search for it. Now I want to name this, and they named it Data Provider Factory Model. So theirs is DAL Factory. So I'm going to name mine Chapter 21 DAL Factory. I'm putting a Chapter 21 in front of it so that I know it's mine instead of theirs. Because we could copy their application. And again, with this chapter, in all of these chapters, there's so many things I can show you. And it's so exciting to look at all these things, but yet can be so stressful to be learning so many things that I really went back and forth on whether we should look at this project or whether we should do it. And so there's a lot of decisions there to be made. So many different code bases that you guys can look at when you look at accessing databases. So that makes it kind of difficult to find help online. Be sure when you're looking for help online, you keep looking for something that looks familiar, because there are so many different ways of doing these things that they can be very, very different from each other, accomplishing the same goal in the end. Now, I was looking at this one, and if you have your textbook out, if you don't, it's fine, but if you do have it out, at the top of page 826, they have like 3 sentences, and they say, begin by adding a reference to the system.configuration.dll assembly and importing the system.configuration namespace. Next, update the app.config file to include the app settings element that they've shown here. So that's one of those times where, with that one sentence, they can give you several different steps that can take a long time to accomplish, depending on how much you remember from previous projects. So the first thing I want to do is add a reference. So in my references, I'm going to add a reference. And that should be the key to all of us. If we go to add a reference and we don't have references over here, we might be looking at a .NET Core type of project that's not going to support the things that we need. So we can kind of use that as a key. Now, the reference that we want to add is system.configuration.dll. And my reference manager opened up here looking at assemblies, and that's where we want to be. So click on assemblies up here if you're not looking at assemblies. As I scroll down, I'll find our system assemblies, and I see our system configuration. So I'll check it and then click OK. So that adds our reference. We see our system.configuration reference over here. Now I need to add the import statement using system.configuration. So at the beginning of C# and halfway through C#, one of the things that stresses me out, halfway through the semester seems to be a real stressful time for me, but one of the things that stresses me out real bad are students that copy zip files and then don't unzip them. None of you are those students, because you guys wouldn't have done that when you were starting out in C#1. But usually we'll all do it once in a while, right? And then we go to open a project and Visual Studio's like could not open some of the files in the project, and eventually we like, oh, I didn't extract from the zip file, so Visual Studio can't open it. So that's a super stressful thing, because some students have a really hard time understanding that, and those are the students that should get like carpentry degrees, right? Sorry, yeah, really, they should, you know. And so it gets stressful because it's hard when people are figuring those kinds of things out, because they've decided they want to do this certain thing, but yet some of those basic mechanisms that we have to go through to make our job work seem irrelevant to them, and they're like, no, I don't want to do that every time I get a project from you, I'm not going to. And so then they can't be successful because they won't do those basic things that we have to do. And the rest of us that are successful, we realize there's certain annoying things that we just have to do, but we do them because that's just what we have to do. We know that there are certain annoying things no matter what our job is that we have to do, and then there are certain parts of it that are really, really valuable and really enjoyable, and we like all of those kinds of things too. Well, now we get to another part that can be really stressful, because we're moving from a lower level capability of being able to copy a project onto a playing ground where that's not possible, right? So this auto lot provider factory project, if I zip it up and send it to you, it's still not going to work, right? If you extract it, you do everything right, you get it open properly, it's still not going to work unless you get all of the connections made properly to your database. You're not going to be able to run it. So notice how we've moved into a new layer of complexity in our learning. Now, that's why it's normal for people to be saying, where's the videos, and for me to lash out and say, I don't have them ready, darn it, because we're moving into that new level. Now you can't just extract a project, unzip it, open it, and have it work. Now you have all these extra other things outside of it that are impacting it, that are going to keep it from working. So it does add another new layer, but you guys can handle it just the same way as you handled extracting things from a compressed folder to open a project. Now you're going to know, oh, there might be other things I have to do outside of this project before I can run it. So it's not going to freak you out if you open something, extract it, and you still can't run it. Well, here's one of those things in my long story, is this configuration. So let's take a look at it. They say we're going to need to update this app.config file. Well, here it is. It's an XML file, right? You guys have seen them, so you know what we're working with. This XML file is a little different though, because the data that we're working with isn't like book data or test data. It's our configuration data for how our project is set up. So all we're seeing right now is our startup configuration as far as what our .NET setup is. So we're going to add some more configuration. So we're going to add keys for our app settings. So app settings, when I close that key, again, the XML editor should write the closing tag for me. So the first one, I'm going to put a comment in here. Is going to be which provider. Just like everybody else, I have caps lock on. And this is why we needed to include or import that configuration tool, because we're going to include our provider information in our app.config file. So we're going to let our configuration file control our application settings instead of putting it in our code. If you remember last time, it's the only time you've written a program that does this, we included our connection string in our C# code, right? That we wanted to use our data source of access, and here's our database file. Well, now we're going to pull it out of our code and put it in a project settings file so that it's safer. People can't find it as easy, and it's more dynamic. We could change it easier, basically. So which provider? Well, to specify that, we have to use that provider key. So I'm going to tell this configuration utility to add a key named provider. And for that key, give it a value. And we're not going to be using the access library that we used last time. We're going to be using the SQL library for SQL Server. So its name is system.data.sql client. So that's our database provider. And we could put that in a connection string just like we did the access stuff. We would just go to Canvas, and where I set up that information about connecting to your server, you would be able to find that connection string for using SQL Server. So we don't have to use this configuration file. It's just an alternative for us. Okay, the next thing we're going to say is which connection string are we going to use? For that, the key that we're going to be updating is the connection string key. And our value is going to be, again, dependent upon our server. So first of all, our server is our data source. I can type this morning. So I'm going to say the data source is equal to that really long server name. So let's see, I've got SQL Management Studio open. There it is. If I do file, connect, it'll come up with that screen that has my server name. And I can Control-C to copy that because I'm sitting there in my server name. Or I could go to Canvas and copy that long string. Either way is fine. And that's what I'm going to paste as my data source. Now my data source is the server name, and this string includes the port number. So I want to take off the comma 1433, my port number, because I don't need that. I need it when I'm using SQL Server Management Studio, but not when I'm making my database connection. So instead of my port number, I need a semicolon to say that's the end of that data source. After that, still within our double quotes, I'm going to specify the initial catalog, which is going to be my database name. So you'll use yours. And then I'm going to say integrated security equals false. And in the book, they say true. So ours is a little bit different. Now that should be all we need for our app settings key. So if you look at the XML file, notice you added this whole key, and within that app settings key, we had two key value pairs, our provider and our connection string. So that's giving us all the information we need to connect to the database. Okay. Now, for all the code that we're going to use for this one, I do just want to give it to you. Let's see if I can find it here. Okay, so on Discord, in our CIS151 server under the in-class programs, I just uploaded that program.cs file. I'm going to open mine in another tool. And copy it. And then I'm going to paste it into the program.cs for this application that we're working on. And I pasted it, if you notice, after the header that I had, because I wanted to see what the differences are. First of all, my namespace, but I want to look at the using statements because they told us we needed to add this system.configuration, but it looks like we maybe might have needed to add a few more. So I just kind of wanted to make everybody notice that. They didn't really say anything about these other system.data using statements that we need, but I'm going to go ahead and grab all of those. I guess I can just drag them up there. And then I want to use my namespace instead of theirs. So I think I'm just going to delete like that. So notice what I'm doing. I'm deleting the beginning of the class, actually all of my program class that hasn't been implemented yet, the namespace, closing curly brace, and the namespace name of what I copied. So I should end up with everything I need. Now this is the code that they demonstrate in the textbook. We'll see, Rich. So let's see if it even works. So we should get some sort of output here. Now, whenever we take a look at what's going on in our code, though, notice we don't really have any sort of try-catch logic. So we might have to set it up in the debugger if we have any sort of problems, because it's not going to be really helpful at telling us what's wrong. First of all, it's saying, get the connection string information from that app.config file. So notice how it's doing that. It's setting up a string and then using the configuration manager to pull in that provider key. Then it's also doing the same thing to gather the connection string information. Is that what we named ours? They say, we didn't really give it a name. So we might need this chapter 21 DAL factory provider. We'll see what happens with that. Now we're trying to set up then our factory, and what the factory is, the whole point of this activity is to show us that if we use this database provider factory class that's available from C#, then we can use the same classes to connect to our database, gather information from our database for any provider. So last time we started out using these SQL classes, and then I said, oh wait, those are the wrong ones. We should be using these OLE classes. That was because I wanted you to see that those different classes are available for different database providers. If we use this factory, then the factory class is going to take care of the differences between those different providers for us. And we could take this code and we could run it using Access. We could run it using SQL Server databases. We could run it using Oracle databases, because our factory is going to take care of those differences for us. So if we can't get it to run, it's not the end of the world, because we're just trying to do all of this fancy configuration. Let's try it and see what kind of errors we get. Have you tried it already? I get something. An error. That's what I thought. So this connection string, OLEDB provider, is not something that exists. So our instance is just named a little bit different. So let's go get that connection string from Canvas. And we'll override it. So looking at Canvas, I'm going to look at this example that says our database server. And this document has all the different information that we need. And here's what it says our connection string should look like. Data source. Oh, and I do have the port number. We'll have to test that. Our initial catalog, user ID, and password. So I'm going to replicate that connection string in our code. Let's try it. We'll hard code it. Just like they have a bunch of different things set here. Should we try some of them first? We have this app settings. Let's try that first one. So many different things we could try. Just go to my app settings and get my connection string. Oh, I got further. Now it knows it's an SQL connection. So it did find it, but when it got to the open, something went awry. Let's try running it again and see if we can tell. Look at that message a little closer. Login failed for user. And Rich had mentioned we don't have a username or a password or anything in our connection string. Should we try adding that? Let's do it. If I go to our app.config, instead of putting the integrated security equals false, what if we put user ID equals Riley RE and password equals whatever we made our password. Let's see, mine is not all in uppercase. I think that's what I made mine. Now, a really important thing. We are now coding security credentials in our code, right? If I was to load this code to GitHub in a public repo, somebody would be able to find my login credentials. Somebody has done that in the past at OTC. They loaded Git code to GitHub that had standard, username, password stuff. We use your user ID and your number as password. And somebody got in. They charged from like midnight to like 6 in the morning when Dr. Ford started getting messages. They charged like $6,000 worth of stuff on Amazon using our AWS accounts, which somehow have a connection to Amazon and were authorized. So I don't know what she's done about that. But in the end, it pointed out the fact that we have to be really careful about saving this kind of information to public repositories. When you set up GitHub and you have the GitHub ignore capabilities down at the bottom when you're doing things, those are some of the things that you want to set up ignore code for. So the GitHub will automatically wipe out any line that has like user ID or password information in it. In the meantime, if you're not setting up those ignore rules, make sure you don't check in code like that to a public repository on GitHub. So if you're using private repositories, you would be okay. And since our code is going to TFS, and that's a private server, we're really okay. because it's going to be saved out there privately. But we want to be super careful about things like that if we're saving to public repos like on GitHub. Is it any better? Does it still hate us? Ah, it did it. I can't believe it. Yes, it is not SA. It says at least it's not SA, the default admin account for a lot of database servers is SA. For system admin, oh, Aaron, the code is on Discord in the in-class programs channel. So what do we have to do? Let's review. When we created our project, we made sure that it was using the .NET framework so that we could use all of our ADO.NET tools and classes. We went and added a reference to that configuration utility, and then that allowed us, using those configuration tools, to update our app.config so that we could add new key value pairs. So these key value pairs don't mean anything until we use them in our code, right? In our code, we found that in order to get those key value pairs, we had to use this basic syntax. But they included some other syntax for us in case you wanted to name those key value pairs something different, like save them as connection strings and have a whole bunch of different ones is the kind of example that they gave us. All right, now looking at the code, when we set up our factory, we were actually able to figure out what database provider we were using, SQL Server, from our connection string because we told it. Then we actually created our connection using the factory. So it figured out, oh, it's SQL Server. Well, I need to use this certain class. Then it gave us information out about our connection object. All sorts of great things. Then we can create our command object. And in our command object, we selected star from inventory. Wow, that's interesting. Notice that in the select statement, my table name is not all in uppercase, but I created my table all in uppercase. So is SQL not case specific? It's not, is it? So I couldn't create another table named like this because SQL would see them as the same table name. So notice how in their select code, they don't have the word select all in uppercase. That's just a convention that we've been using. So they actually put that code in there, the same select statement that we used last time, only we were going against our little access database table. And now we're using that same exact code to get all of the information from our SQL Server database. So awesome. We got everything we needed. Now some drawbacks. They talk about some drawbacks using this data provider factory model. It's very powerful, but we have to make sure that our code here, our code base, uses only types and methods common to all providers. So that means if I were using some database management system that had some special capability, I wouldn't be able to probably implement it correctly using this database factory. So this factory thing is just a special way for us to be able to connect to the database without specifying, oh, I'm using the SQL Server database objects. Questions? Questions about it? Okay, so if you got this working, some things, that means that your tables are all created okay. You should have a database diagram that shows you what your tables look like and how they're all connected to each other, how the relationships are associated. We've got this factory code that we've been able to actually connect to our database. We know how to do it. Now I want to show you, before we move on from this, how we could have overridden that connection string ourselves in our code. Right here, where we're establishing our connection string, we're using this configuration manager, which is super powerful, and that's what we want to do. But we could actually put that connection string directly in our code, just like we did last time. So if I look at my app config and I copy all that connection string information, I should be able to just put that in my code, clean it up a little bit. Now, notice how that manager is taking care of like continuation for us so much better. And I'm gonna have to worry about, oh, I'm gonna have to end this string and add more and stuff like that, because it is kind of taking care of some things. Oh, and it's made it all gross. I'm gonna go copy that from Canvas instead, because it's too ugly. Get my server name in a little bit better of a situation there without all those spaces. Now again, because I'm not using that configuration utility, I'm going to have to continue my strings a little bit more. I think I've got that formatted now. So instead of going to the configuration manager to get that connection string, I could just supply the connection string just like we did for our access database. I'm going to run it and make sure that it'll work that way. It does still work. It goes and gets all of my database stuff. So great. Now the next section of our text talks about working with our connection object. There's just a few pages. I want you to make sure you look through that, because establishing your connection with your database is very, very important. We've worked with it a lot. There's a little bit more information in your text. The next thing they cover is talking about working with data readers. So they have an example that's very similar to the one we did last time. In our example last time, we used a Windows form, so we took that data that we read from the database and posted it into a form. In their example, they're going to use the console and get some data. And then what's left is the CRUD model, working with the create, update, and delete queries. So we're ready in really good shape to work on that one next time and get everything all working so that we can update this database and do all of the things with it that we need to do. Oh, thank you, Ivy. So let's look at what we've got. Last time, our assignment is to create the employee base table. So I know, looking at databases, that a lot of people have the table itself created. So you're going to create your table and create the associated class code to go along with that. And that one is due tomorrow night. We won't look at it or anything Wednesday. Don't worry about that. It's just one for you to get turned in and be showing that you're making your progress, kind of a checkpoint more than anything. So please let me know if you're having any trouble with that one so we can get you off to a good start on it. For this week, we have an assignment that is family table. So for this one, you're going to create another table in your database that's just going to hold information about your family. and family members. So you could call it whatever you like. Some of the things that you want to keep track of column-wise are like first name, last name, what kind of relationship they are to you, you know, like parent or mother or whatever, their hometown and their age, anything like that. You might want different types of columns, that's okay. But go ahead and add some test data to your table. Then your application is going to display the information from that table. But instead of using a list box like we did last time, we're going to set up your table as a data source to a data grid. So it's going to dynamically, bam, fill up that data grid and give you all of the information that you need using that data grid. I've included a link to the Doyle PDF because in chapter 14 of that old book, there's a walkthrough that does this same exact type of thing. There's also a walkthrough in our textbook in our next chapter, so chapter 22. The difference being just that the Doyle book uses more of a family type table. Our textbook uses some different information, or car lot type thing. And so you should have lots of different examples, maybe too many. In the videos, the instructor videos, there are some walkthroughs of just creating the data grid. Now, the thing that there are not necessarily walkthroughs of are adding the selection. So it's one thing to have the data grid and have it just display all of the rows in your table, but we'd like this to allow selection. So maybe you're going to add a text box to let them type. Oh, I think in the Doyle book, I think they suggest hometown, like everybody that's from, you know, Reed Springs or whatever is going to list because you type that in. Now, students have done this in many, many different ways. Some students will only put, you know, like the last name. That's fine. Any sort of selection is acceptable. We just want something for the user to type that limits the list. You know what I mean? Because that's such a common thing for us to do in an application. Other people like to get really involved in it and try lots of different options, like allow the user to select by hometown or age or type of relationship or whatever it is. So your requirements are just some sort of selection like that. So in your code, you're going to be updating the select statement. In the examples in the textbook, they're going to show you how to use the tools, the data grid tools, to update the select statement that's kind of hidden, that's sort of buried, that Visual Studio is using. Oh, Rich, it is the next chapter, chapter 22 in our book, talks about using entity framework. So the different textbooks kind of focus on different aspects of it. So you'll see that they both are talking about the same topic, but again, from a very different presentation point of view. So it gives you a little bit of a difference. Okay, I'm going to stop there, get videos updated, see what else is going on. But if you have problems, please let me know. Again, just like the person who only needs to extract from the zip file. Did you guys have any people like that in C#1? I lose students because of that, because they won't ask, what they're doing wrong. They figure it's something that's their fault. They're going to figure it out, and they never do. And so they drop. So don't let little things like that keep you from being successful. How sad is that I could have someone that's in C#1 for 6 weeks that's already been through the 120 class and the 130, and they decide that CIS is not for them because they can't get a project to open right in Visual Studio. And using REPL makes it worse because everybody's been using REPL and they haven't been using Visual Studio and they don't even realize. So you don't know how frustrating that is an instructor to have people that were so close that could be successful that give up because of some small little thing. So please let me know if there's a problem. And if I gripe at you, just say, okay, I can take this. And then we'll figure out what the problem is and go from there, because that's where we are. But I think everybody's in pretty good shape. So tell me if you're not. Otherwise, I can't help. And I'm going to stop talking there. Any questions? All working? Great job. I will see you guys Wednesday. Everybody stay safe and healthy. I have a guy in my 120 class who's stressing me out. He thinks he's got COVID. And so he thinks he gave it to everybody. So he keeps messaging on Discord. He's like freaking out. You guys, I think I was sick when I did. You guys, please be careful. So what kind of stress is that for him? I don't want anybody to have that kind of stress. It's too much. He's fine. Everybody's done everything fine. Okay, guys. Bye, 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 bye. Let me know if you need anything. Thank you. No, it won't let me end it.